Hi, and welcome to Postscript. I'm John Petersen from the Arlington Institute, and it's nice to have you with us here. We're coming from Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, just 100 miles down the road from Washington and Baltimore, and it's a crisp October afternoon, and it's nice to have you with us, and it's nice to have our guest today, Robert David Steele. Robert, nice to see you.
John?
We do this, as you may know, if you visit us on a regular basis, on about a monthly basis, and it is based upon a program that the Arlington Institute sponsors here in Berkeley Springs called Transition Talks, where we bring noted speakers from around the world to talk about the extraordinary kind of change that's going on in the world and for humans in this amazing period of time. And Robert, you're a guy that certainly qualifies in that space. I mean, you've been a spy, and you've initiated, you invented the open source intelligence kind of movement, and on and on and on. And I guess you're going to talk today about how that some of the books that you've read have changed your life. And I was wondering, kind of to start with, if you could, how did you, I mean, you were in the Marine Corps, you did all these kinds of Washington kind of things. How did you look at the world at that point?
I grew up as the son of an oil man, so I always understood the world a little bit better than your average American, who many of whom don't leave one county their whole lives. I basically never questioned authority. Yeah. I never questioned the official narrative. I just assumed that America was the greatest, that everything we were doing was for a good reason, and that my job was to follow orders. Now, we hung people in the Nuremberg trials for following orders. Right. I didn't really start waking up until I left the entire government behind me. I mean, my open source intelligence initiative failed completely because it's a threat to the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency. It's a threat to the two-party tyranny. Right. In fact, I was briefing Senator Pat Roberts, who wrote the foreword to my second book. I was briefing his top national security person on why we need an open source agency. And she said, well, what's the mission statement for this agency? I said, to tell the truth about everything. She literally got up and walked out, okay? The U.S. government, and Congress in particular, is not interested in the truth about everything. So to answer your question, I got into books. I've always been a reader, and I had a very good education. But I got into books when I wrote my first two books, On Intelligence, Spies and Secrecy in an Open World, and then the second book, The New Craft of Intelligence, Personal, Public, and Political. And for each of those two books, I reviewed roughly 150 books, okay? The first set mostly on secrecy and spies, the second on what became the open source intelligence discipline. And Amazon had just started in around 2004, I forget the date. They had started to review things, so I uploaded my 300 annotated bibliographic entries on Amazon. I was instantly the top 1,500 reviewer. I ultimately became Amazon reviewer number 25 until Amazon started manipulating reviews and banning reviewers and banning reviews, because Amazon is very much part of what we call hashtag Google Gestapo. Yeah. Okay, they're deplatforming and censoring everybody that's critical. So to make a long story short, something got me to start reading, and I have no idea. I mean, you and I were just joking before, maybe some extraterrestrial force was guiding my reading, you know, like the water wand. But it didn't occur to me that there was a sense or a rhyme or a reason to all of this until I created a townhouse as my office. Yeah. An entire floor was my library. That was the first time I'd ever organized my library. And that's when I discovered that I was reading in 98 different categories, which is quite unusual.
Yeah. Well, I'm very sympathetic to your kind of transition. I grew up in the Midwest in a very conservative religious family where right was right and wrong was, and it was white and black and everything. And then I moved to Chicago and got involved in politics. And there was no right and wrong. I mean, you were suddenly thrown into the middle of all this thing, and all this stuff that they taught you from your youth was called into question, and you start saying, wait a second. And then systematically, when you hang around Washington a little bit, you suddenly find out there just is no truth and no integrity, and it's just broadly based and widespread. I mean, that's overstating it somewhat, but
No, I mean,
I mean, there are people in some of the agencies who are really wonderful people. Come on.
90% of everybody in Washington is a good person trapped in a bad system.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But what really troubles me, I mean, when I was educated at Muhlenberg College, I got a very good classical liberal arts education. I learned how to think critically. I had to struggle for every grade. Yeah. Today, our colleges are producing people who are no better than a high school graduate in the 1950s. Okay, it's a complete scam. Our colleges are also completely corrupt. Basically, they've been bought out, and they're censoring people. And you have all of these universities that have all of these little wimpy morons that get triggered by truthful statements about reality. So the American country, not America as a whole, because you've got a lot of really decent blue collar and white collar people who have integrity,
right,
and they have imagination, and they know what's what, and they know how to smell BS. Okay, but our college generation is seriously stupid and emotionally immature and totally pliant. They've become like little puppets.
Oh, they have, yeah. Well, the system is all set up to manipulate everybody, you know, of course, and so it's an interesting kind of issue about how you get people to think independently and critically, and the educational system certainly doesn't.
I wish I could remember the man's name. He just published a superb piece in Politico. He's a philosophy professor at John Jay University in New York. And in fact, we've had some emails because he's pointed out that we're not learning how to talk to each other. We're not learning how to have a conversation and bring forward facts and respect the different perspectives. I'm actually thinking about the need for a national tour, a national Chautauqua, which is how we used to educate the rural public with a traveling caravan of speakers.
Yeah.
You know, like you and me would just get in a van and drive around the Midwest and do talks. But I think there's a need for a national conversation that is led by the president, perhaps facilitated by this professor, that includes people like Jesse Ventura, Cynthia McKinney, Marianne Williamson, Tomi Lahren, Ron Paul, Dennis Kucinich, myself. And I think we need to have a conversation about America. We need to have a conversation about the Constitution. For example, let me just say very quickly, I am stunned to have Ralph Nader say that we should abolish the Electoral College. What part of we're the 50 United States of America does he not understand? The Electoral College is how the states elect the president.
Yeah.
It's not about California and New York as a public majority electing the president. So anybody who doesn't understand why the Electoral College does exist is stupid. Okay? Ralph Nader is stupid. Or, if he's not stupid, he's corrupt. Because he probably knows full well that the Electoral College is about giving voice and vote to the heartland. Okay? So I really think we have to have a huge conversation across this country.
Well, we're into this extraordinary time of change where all of the kind of the status quo, the legacy systems are called into question. And some, I would argue, are in the process of imploding because
they're all imploding.
Structurally, they're just unsustainable. And so the question becomes then, how do you navigate, how do you negotiate your way through this highly volatile, chaotic kind of the process that's going from one kind of historical set of kind of stability into a new world that's emerging that's not obvious yet, it's not clear. And And that then brings me to saying, I mean, you can't go into this saying, I just obey orders. Somehow you got to start to see the world.
Well, let's. I mean, we'll be talking about this.
Yeah.
Okay, and this is going to be free online at Steele-Top-Books.
Okay.
So people can read my lecture and they can see the graphics. Let me answer your question at 3 levels. Level number 1, and this goes back to Plato, it goes back to Will and Ariel Durant and Lessons of History and Philosophy and the Social Problem. The absolute root core of national power is an educated citizenry.
Right.
That's number 1. If Trump wants to be the greatest president ever, he's got to become the education president. And I don't see that happening, but it could still happen.
Yeah.
Okay? Number 2, all of our institutions are totally and absolutely corrupt with respect to the integrity of information and data. And let me make it clear that in the intelligence community, we collect 1% of what is published, which is 1% of what is written, which is 1% of what is known.
Yeah.
All right? There's nobody out there that is actually trying to do holistic analytics or true cost economics on the totality of information.
Right. Systems approach.
Now, here's the good news. I believe that in 2012, just as the Mayans had predicted, Earth reached a tipping point, a spiritual cosmic tipping point. And we're at the beginning now, we're 7 years into 1,000 years of peace and prosperity. And I am absolutely convinced that, for example, we're going to see, I mean, Mark Zuckerberg just signed his death warrant, okay? We are seeing the panic at Facebook and Google and Twitter and Meetup and YouTube. Those are all corrupt corporations that have been censoring people, all right? And they've been censoring people because they are afraid of the public waking up. If you look around the world, from Ecuador, where a mayor was just dragged through the streets for not fulfilling his promises, to France with the yellow jackets, to Spain where Catalan is exploding, to Saudi Arabia where the regime is in serious risk of being assassinated overnight, people are rising up. And that leads to my final point. There's a brilliant man who wrote the book called Black Swan, Nassim Nicholas Taleb. And I have one of his books as one of my top 50 cosmic books. He talks about localization as how you survive in complex times.
Yeah. Yep.
Now, Elinor Ostrom got a Nobel...
Community.
Yes, well, family and community.
Right.
But local.
Right.
Elinor Ostrom got a Nobel Peace Prize in economics for her book Governing the Commons, which had 2 key points. Number 1, the only people that know enough about the local situation to make sensible rules are the local people.
Yeah, right.
And number 2, the only people that are ever present who are able to enforce the rules in an equitable, consistent, pervasive, permanent manner are the local people. Now, I say in my lecture, which everyone can get free online, the federal government now either needs to be abolished or reduced by 70%. If you look at the Declaration of Independence and the conditions in the Declaration of Independence, every single condition that justified the independence of the United States from Great Britain today justifies the independence of every state of the Union from Washington.
Right. Well, that's just the beginning of this period of time in the next 5 to 7 years when I think you're going to see more change than you've ever seen before.
I agree.
And so the question then, to circle back to where we started, is, so you've read all of these books. How did it start? To give us a couple of examples of some of the books and how it started to change your mind and break you out of this kind of...
That's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant question. 9/11. Plain and simple. It's now known that the Twin Towers were condemned in 1988.
Wow.
And they became an immediate $2 billion insurance albatross on the states of New York and New Jersey. People need to understand that the Twin Towers were owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey until July of the year in which Zionist Israel took down the Twin Towers with the complicity of Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. 9/11 was an inside job. Now, I looked at 9/11.
Insurance deal.
What's that?
It was an insurance deal, wasn't
Well,
it?
no, actually, it started as an insurance deal. It started as insurance fraud. What I believed happened is that in 1990, Dick Cheney was privately briefed by Benjamin Netanyahu, because what you have here in 9/11 is Larry Silverstein, the builder, who talked to Netanyahu on a weekly basis, and Mel, I forget his last name, but he runs the AIG Insurance Corporation, which is a massive scam. It's also an intelligence agency. Basically, if you're insured, all your stuff is being read by the CIA. They know where your mistress is in her house that you're paying for and insuring and so forth. But I believe that Cheney and Netanyahu were briefed no later than 1990, and they said, "Praise be to the Lord. This is a terrorist incident in the future that will justify a police state in the United States and endless war abroad." 9/11 was an inside job. I've published a book that was delivered to the president, which is free online at tinyurl/911-POTUS. It's absolutely crystal clear that 9/11 was controlled demolitions, all three things, and that the Pentagon was either a missile or an inside-out explosion. I've cleaned up after a Marine Corps helicopter accident, and I've seen other aircraft disasters. And first off, the engines and the wings never go into the building. Second off, you have luggage and body parts and seats everywhere. Okay, and the FBI went around. By the way, the FBI and the CIA were complicit in 9/11 before and after the fact. George Tenet and the FBI and at CIA and the FBI confiscated videotapes of evidence. They shut down Able Danger, which had identified some of the patsy hijackers in advance, and so forth. This was a U.S. government operation. So 9/11 is what turned me on to the reality that my government was lying to us about everything. Then I started reading broadly. Then we had Sandy Hook and the Boston bombing. And then we had Orlando. I wrote a chapter on Orlando with 70 anomalies that I, as a loyal, patriotic American, sent to the director of the FBI by registered mail saying, if I have anything about Orlando wrong, please tell me. He never answered. These are false flag operations. Now, false flag means nothing more than not what it appears to be. The term originated in piracy, where they would fly the flag of the enemy until they got close enough. So I would say 9/11 is what made me realize that we are living in what John Rappaport calls the matrix of lies. And that's what really got me started thinking about this. Then I started thinking about intelligence reform. And I started realizing, as I read in economic books, there is infinite wealth on this planet for every single one of the 5 billion poor to live like a middle-class American. But they're not allowed to. The wealth is actually concentrated by the banks, and the banks are using war as a profit center, and they're manipulating currency and stock exchanges, interest rates, to basically treat the 99%, the deplorables, as cattle. One final point. One of the books that I'm going to be discussing is one of the mind-altering, life-changing books is called Fruits of Graft by Wayne Jett. It documents that the Great Depression was contrived by the banks with the complicity of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The Great Depression was contrived in order to destroy the middle class that was seeking additional political power, to buy up America at Depression-level prices, and to consolidate banking control over the U.S. government. All of the suffering in the Great Depression was contrived by the banks, just as wars today are contrived by the banks.
And anticipated and orchestrated to some extent by the Tavistock Institute, which is another one of the books.
Yes.
Which is just mind-blowing. When I read that thing, it just kind of drives you against the wall, and you say, God, major thing that's happened since the beginning of the last century has been planned. And
yes. I mean, really, World War I, World War II, all of the Middle East problems, these are all contrived. Now, I was in the CIA for 9 years, 3 back-to-back tours overseas, 5 times the regional recruiting average, but I was never held accountable for surveillance detection routes. So CIA lives immunity rather than cover, or lives impunity. Nothing that I've spoken about goes back to the CIA other than the fact that I did run a false flag operation for the CIA. And that's one way of establishing credibility. And what I'm finding now is that I'm a bridge person. There are a lot of Americans that understand false flags and the deep state, extraterrestrials, underground tunnels, whatever, but they're deathly afraid of saying anything because they'll be called a lunatic or lose their job or be censored or whatever. And then you have all those people over here who actually know and are party to all of this, and that includes the heads of Lockheed and Northrop Grumman and Raytheon and so forth. What I am doing, a lot of people are starting to send me letters of praise or emails of praise saying, Robert, thank you. Because what I am doing is I'm making it respectable to question authority.
Yeah.
And I'm making it possible for people to understand that, yes, there are such things as extraterrestrials or deep underground military bases or genetic experimentation or pedophilia. I mean, in my role as chief counsel for the Judicial Commission of Inquiry into Human Trafficking and Child Sex Abuse, we were years ahead of President Trump. But God bless President Trump, because that executive order of his, and we should talk about Epstein, that executive order of his is what is setting up the collapse of the deep state. So 8 million, up to 8 million children a year are vanishing. Many of them are being tortured to create adrenochrome for that blood high. They're being murdered in satanic ritual abuses. They're being put into incinerators, and nobody is missing them. All right, so there's a lot of great evil going on. Having said that, I think we are at the beginning of a very, very bright, prosperous period for not just America, but for the entire world.
You got any sense about how that transpires in the next half dozen years? I mean, what?
I cannot second guess our president. I believe he will be elected in the mother of all landslides. Yeah. I think this Democratic impeachment over a published transcript where there's no impeachable offense, particularly when you compare it to the fact that Hillary Clinton sold Yemen and Syria to Saudi Arabia, she sold Libya to France, and she sold Uranium One to Russia. And she had 30,000 emails, many of which dealt with her pedophilia adventures, okay, with the Podestas and so forth. I think the president's going to win in the mother of all landslides. At my blog, phi-beta-iota.net, I have listed 14 things the president can do to assure the mother of all landslides. Student debt jubilee, cancel the federal income tax, which can be replaced by Edgar Feige's automated payment transaction tax, nationalize the Federal Reserve, defend the First Amendment by either nationalizing or shutting down Google Gestapo, defend the Second Amendment by challenging false flags and mind-controlled active shooters. Defend the Fourth Amendment by closing down NSA and closing down TSA. TSA is now putting these naked machines into shopping malls, and they're electromagnetically polluting shopping malls. This is the airport machines. They basically show you naked. But in order to show you naked, you have to be deeply radiated, okay? So TSA should be shut down. NSA should be shut down. In fact, I work with Bill Binney. Yeah. I'm a huge admirer of Mike Flynn, who I believe will be vindicated completely. I believe Mike Flynn's attorney has a copy of the still secret Department of Justice memorandum that completely exonerates General Flynn. And the government is withholding that. Right. At some point, it's going to be produced, and General Flynn will have all the charges dropped, and the government will apologize to him, in my opinion. Similarly, Roger Stone, I think, is going to get vindicated at some point. Right now, he's dealing with a very biased judge in Washington, D.C., who is politically charged. But the things that the president can do are extraordinary. The other thing that I've noticed, I believe, is that there is a personal relationship between Xi Jinping in China, Vladimir Putin in Russia, and Donald Trump in the United States of America. I think they're talking to each other at a level that Mike Pompeo has no idea.
Well, we're going to have to come back and talk about that some other time because we're out of time. And it's been really great to have you. And we hope that you'll join us later next month when we have John McMichael, Dr. John McMichael, who's going to talk about the leading edge of some extraordinary kind of medical kind of research that's coming downstream. And you can, again, find out all about our upcoming speaker series at transitiontalks.org. So come out and visit us here in Berkeley Springs. We'd love to have you. A wonderful little town, just 100 miles from Washington and Baltimore, and we do this every month. So I'm John Petersen from the Arlington Institute, and thanks for being with us.